fear is paralyzing. Knowledge is empowering.
On October 22nd, 1989, all seemed well in the small town of St. Joseph, Minnesota. No one expected what was to come later that evening. In 1989, 11-year-old Jacob Wetterling was abducted from the small town of St. Joseph, Minnesota. This became a high-profile case that received national attention and was a turning point in the history of the United States because of its modifications and improvements to the criminal justice and legislative systems, as well as changes to everyday life. The case generated heightened awareness, organization, legislation, and various steps in the prevention of child abduction and abuse cases. 11-year-old Jacob Wetterling, his younger brother Trevor, and his best friend Aaron Larson were biking home from a local convenience store around 9:30 that night. They were stopped less than a mile from their home. A masked gunman stepped out of the shadows, told the boys to lie in a ditch, and asked them their ages. Trevor, who was 10, and Aaron, who was 11, were told, one at a time, to run into the neighboring woods and to not look back. The boys did as they were told, but turned around in time to catch a glimpse of the man grabbing Jacob's shoulder. This was the last known sighting of Jacob Wetterling. He remains missing to this day. Before Jacob's abduction, people had a different sense of security. Children tended to go out early in the morning with their friends and return home when the sun went down. It wasn't unusual for children not to check in during the day. Abductions were so unpublicized that it did not occur to people that they would happen, especially in small towns. This was because people believed small towns were safer, which was one of the reasons that the Wetterlings moved to St. Joseph in the first place. In reality, though, a large percent of abductions occur in small towns.
People didn't let their kids out. People, checked in on their kids. It wasn't where, when I was a kid, or your folks were a kid, where you go out and play and then you come back at noon. People are actually going over and making sure they check in with the kids.
Before Jacob's kidnapping, law enforcement was not prepared for an abduction to occur. They did not have the necessary tools or training to handle abductions. Communication, access to information, and time-consuming methods of research were issues that deterred the police from making significant progress. Before the abduction, methods that were in place to solve and prevent kidnappings included the Parental Kidnapping Prevention Act, passed in 1980, the 911 system, originally introduced in 1968, the use of biometric technology, such as fingerprint reading and facial reconstruction, were used to help identify victims and perpetrators, and the Missing Children's Act, passed in 1984, which let police share information in the NCIC database. The Jacob Wetterling abduction was a turning point in the criminal justice and legislative systems of the United States because the reform and incentive that emerged compelled organizations, law enforcement, and legislation to prevent kidnappings. It also impacted society, affecting personal lives and how people handle child abduction and abuse cases. The kidnapping of Jacob Wetterling opened people's eyes to the dangers of society. Parents reacted in many different ways. Some didn't let their children go out anymore, while others made their children call to check in and let them know where they were. People started to realize that even though they had moved to small towns to be safer, sometimes small towns weren't safer at all.
One thing I learned is that a lot of missing children come from small, rural, isolated areas like St. Joseph, Minnesota.
Because of the atypical circumstances surrounding Jacob's kidnapping and the idea that the Wetterlings were perceived as a typical Midwestern family, the press was intrigued and circulated information at a national level.
There was so much fear.
We were scared to go outside even when it happened.
As the media spread word of Jacob's abduction, one of the initial reactions, fear, spread with it. The fear that was experienced motivated people to become informed about abductions and try to prevent them. Throughout the nation, there was also a loss of security and a new distrust of people. This influenced many changes regarding safety measures for children to be created. The awareness of abductions also led to the realization that they can happen anywhere at any time. 4 months after the abduction, Jerry and Patty Wetterling created the Jacob Wetterling Foundation to help people learn about who takes children, why they do it, and how to prevent it. It later became the Jacob Wetterling Resource Center, also known as the JWRC. They have partnered with the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children and the Association of Missing and Exploited Children's Organizations. The JWRC has assisted in over 500 missing person cases. Shortly after Jacob's abduction, Patty Wetterling asked law enforcement what they needed.
And they told me two things. One was a central repository of information, one home base for all of the tips and leads and suspects and everything that they were acquiring. And otherwise, you'd have to go county by county and city by city to find out what everybody had. So that was strengthened. They'd already begun to build it. It was strengthened. And then the second one was a sex offender registry to know who's done this before.
After Jacob was abducted, Patty was forced into the knowledge of a world where people abduct children for sexual exploitation. In 1991, using their newfound knowledge, Patty and Jerry Wetterling, along with others, developed a bill to create a tool that would aid police. The bill was then sponsored by Congressman Jim Ramstad. The Jacob Wetterling Crimes Against Children and Sexually Violent Offenders Registration Act, also known as the Jacob Wetterling Act, was then passed in 1994 as part of the Federal Crime Control and Law Enforcement Act. The Jacob Wetterling Act required states to create a sex offender registry that any police department in the state could access or input information. The registry helped clear suspects faster.
It clears people faster than, when you know who lives in the area, you can find out where were they and if they have done anything since their crime.
Although the Jacob Wetterling Act and the JWRC have continued to be effective, Patty Wetterling and many others are still actively advocating for children's safety. Among many things, she helped Minnesota become one of the first states to get the Amber Alert System law passed. The Amber Alert is a notification about a missing child that is sent out to the public via every form of technology, ensuring the thorough spread of information about a missing minor. The Amber Alert was a turning point in the way that information was spread at a national and international level, both in speed and in means. Many acts were passed in order to amend the Jacob Wetterling Act. One was the Jacob Wetterling Improvements Act, which states that sex offenders need to register in states other than their state of current residence and state of offense. Offenders also had to register in states where they were born and raised, educated, and had previously held jobs. The Departments of Commerce, Justice and State, the Judiciary and Related Agencies Appropriations Act was passed to make the sex offender registry nationally accessible. Megan's Law, named after Megan Kanka, a 7-year-old girl who was abducted and killed by her sex offender neighbor, required law enforcement to make their sex offender database available to the public and to notify a state's population when a registered sex offender is living, visiting, or working in the state. It also mandated the creation of a database at the FBI to track whereabouts of registered offenders. This was a turning point for law enforcement training. Police officers received training from the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children in Washington, D.C., and even though not all states have departments that specialize in kidnapping, all law enforcement has a broader knowledge of what to do in an abduction situation.
All over the United States, I think, just because of Jacob's case and other missing children, that the trainings are a lot more. Back in the day, I don't think they had any trainings just for the abducted children. I've been out to the National Center for Missing Children in Washington, D.C., and they've been here a few times.
The National Child Protection Training Center merged with the JWRC in 2010 in order to combine their resources and further their efforts to help find missing children. The Jacob Wetterling case was a turning point in the history of the United States because of the modifications and improvements it made to the criminal justice and legislative systems, as well as changes it made to everyday life. The case inspired the creation of tools to help solve abduction and abuse cases, as well as changing the way people parented. Although the kidnapping of Jacob Wetterling was devastating to his family and many others, it was critical in pointing out some issues about tactics on finding missing people. Jacob's case has changed the United States and the world forever on how people handle these situations.
He changed state law, he changed federal law, and he changed hearts and minds.
In spite of still being missing, Jacob has had a great impact on others who have been kidnapped. Even though Jacob's mother, Patty, said her goal was for this to never happen to anyone again, there are still improvements that need to be made and measures to be taken. These steps are slowly being taken to make the world a safer place.
And I will wait for you. And I will